All right, so it looks like our listeners are really interested in getting a deeper understanding of the G7. They send us a ton of fascinating material.
Yeah, it seems like everyone wants to move beyond just the headlines and really get to the heart of what this group is all about.
We've got news articles, economic reports, even some opinion pieces, so we're ready to dive in.
It's a smart choice because the G7's influence is a lot more complex than it might seem at first glance.
Yeah, it's not just a few powerful countries getting together for a photo op. There's some real depth to uncover here.
Absolutely understanding those nuances, that's where things get really interesting.
Okay, so let's unpack this. The G7, that's Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the United Kingdom, and the United States.
Right.
They're often called a global powerhouse, but they also get a lot of criticism for being an outdated club.
Yeah, you always hear both sides.
We're going to explore both sides of that coin, dig into their history, their economic and political clout, and try to figure out what their future might hold.
Sounds good.
Now, one thing that really struck me going through all this material is how much the G7 is a product of its time.
Yeah, that's a great point.
It was born out of a crisis, the 1970s oil crisis to be exact,
Right.
when those 6 original members needed a way to coordinate economic policies in a world that had suddenly become very unstable.
Exactly. It was a moment where they realized they needed to work together to navigate those choppy waters.
I can see how that kind of shared experience, that we're all in this together feeling, would really push them to formalize a group like this.
It definitely brought them closer together.
But then Canada joined a year later, making the G7. Was that more of a, hey, don't leave us out situation?
Um, well, there's definitely an element of that.
Okay.
Canada being a major industrialized economy and having such close ties with the U.S. especially, they wanted to have a seat at the table.
Right. Makes sense.
And it highlights something really crucial about the G7 membership. It's as much about political relationships as it is about raw economic power.
Ah, so it's not just about how much money you've got, it's about who you know. It's a bit of both.
Okay, so let's fast forward a few decades and things get even more interesting.
Okay.
Russia joins the party, making it the G8 for a while, but then gets kicked out in 2014 after annexing Crimea.
Right. A major turning point.
Does that kind of geopolitical maneuvering cast a shadow over the group's claims of being all about global stability?
It certainly adds a layer of complexity,
Yeah.
and it really ties into this bigger question about the G7's relevance in a world where global power isn't so concentrated anymore.
It's not just the US and the Soviet Union calling all the shots anymore.
Exactly. We're not in a Cold War system of 2 superpowers.
Right.
This is what's called a multipolar world, where influence is more spread out.
Now that's a term I've heard but never fully grasped.
Okay, sure.
So multipolar means multiple centers of power, like with the rise of China and India, challenging that traditional G7 dominance.
Precisely.
Got it.
And that's why understanding the G7 isn't just about knowing their combined GDP,
Right.
though that number is staggering close to half the entire world's output.
Wow, yeah, that's huge. It's about understanding how their internal dynamics and this shifting global landscape are constantly pushing and pulling at them.
So there's a lot more going on beneath the surface than meets the eye.
There's always more to the story.
Now, speaking of those internal dynamics, something that jumped out at me from the economic reports you sent was how differently these G7 countries are grappling with things like inflation, debt, and economic inequality.
Oh, yeah, it's fascinating.
It's not all rosy just because you're in the club, huh?
Not at all. Each country has its own unique set of challenges,
Right.
and it's fascinating to see how those shared challenges play out in such different ways.
Yeah, like take Japan, for instance. Their aging population is shrinking their workforce and putting immense pressure on social safety nets.
Right, a huge issue for them.
And that limits their ability to use traditional economic tools to fight inflation.
It really ties their hands.
And then you've got Italy struggling with that massive debt burden, which has been a drag on their economy for years.
Oh, yeah, it's been a constant struggle.
It makes you wonder how those internal weaknesses affect their position within the G7 and their ability to act on the world stage.
It's a constant balancing act.
Yeah.
They're trying to manage their own domestic issues while also contributing to these grand G7 goals.
Like climate change or global security.
Exactly.
Are they always in sync?
I doubt it.
And this idea of internal weaknesses impacting their global role, that really hit home for me when I was reading about the G7's influence on the Paris Agreement.
Okay, interesting.
On one hand, they were key players pushing for action on climate change.
Right, they were really advocating for it.
But on the other hand, their own carbon emissions are a major part of the problem.
That contradiction is at the heart of a lot of the criticisms directed at the G7.
Yeah, it's like they're saying, do as I say, not as I do.
And then there's the whole issue of representation.
Right, because critics argue that the G7 doesn't really represent the voices of the global south.
It's a major point of contention.
Could you unpack that term for us? I think it's one of those phrases that people hear but aren't always clear on what it truly means.
It's a great question because understanding who's not at the table is just as important as understanding who is.
Right.
The Global South generally refers to countries in Latin America, Asia, Africa, and Oceania, many of whom are dealing with the legacies of colonialism and facing really unique development challenges.
So essentially, those voices and perspectives, those entire continents worth of lived experiences, are largely missing from the G7's internal discussions.
They're not being fully represented.
It raises the question, are their solutions, their priorities, really serving the entire globe or just a select few?
That's the debate.
And that leads to this bigger debate about whether the G7 should even exist in its current form.
It's a valid question.
Some argue it's an outdated model reflecting a world order that's rapidly disappearing.
Right, it's not the 1970s anymore.
Others say that despite its flaws, it's still a crucial platform for tackling global issues.
They see it as the best we've got.
Okay, so we've got this group born out of crisis, holding immense economic and political power, but facing internal struggles and accusations of being out of touch. It's a pretty compelling story, and we've only just scratched the surface.
Indeed, and what's fascinating is how this story isn't just about economics and politics.
Okay.
It's interwoven with cultural trends, societal values, and the aspirations of people around the world.
It's a human story at its core.
It is. Welcome back to our deep dive into the G7. Now let's shift our focus to the relationships within this group.
Okay, so it's one thing to have these 7 major economies at the table, but how do their individual interests, sometimes clashing styles, actually play out in practice?
Well, it's like any group of people, right? You've got different personalities,
Yeah.
different priorities.
Right, and in this case, those personalities happen to represent entire countries?
Exactly.
It makes me think of that saying, too many cooks in the kitchen.
Yeah, I can see that.
You've got these powerful countries, each with their own history, their own domestic pressures, trying to find common ground on these huge global issues.
And that's the constant challenge of diplomacy, finding that balance between national interests and shared goals.
So where do we see that play out most clearly?
Well, one of the most prominent dynamics within the G7 is the relationship between the U.S. and the U.K.
Right. They've always been close allies.
It's often referred to as the special relationship, and for good reason.
Yeah, they share deep historical ties, a common language, and cultural heritage, and they often align on foreign policy issues.
They've been through a lot together.
But even close allies can have disagreements. I'm thinking of those recent trade tensions post-Brexit.
Oh yeah, that was a tricky situation.
Does that kind of friction ever spill over into the G7's work?
It certainly can, and that's a great example of how domestic politics, internal pressures within each country can ripple outwards and affect these international collaborations.
The G7 isn't immune to that reality.
No group is.
So it's almost like watching a family drama play out on the world stage.
A bit, yeah.
You've got your close siblings, the US and the UK, but then what about the other relationships? Are there any other power couples within the G7?
France and Germany are an interesting case.
Okay.
They've been the driving force behind European integration for decades and often present a united front within the G7.
Advocating for a strong European voice on the global stage.
Exactly.
But I've also read about tensions between them, especially on economic issues.
Yeah, there are definitely some differences there.
Germany, with its focus on fiscal discipline, and France sometimes pushing for more government spending. How do they reconcile those differences when they need to act as a bloc within the G7?
That's the constant balancing act of diplomacy. It requires compromise, finding that sweet spot where national interest and shared goals overlap.
Right.
And sometimes it works seamlessly, other times it's a messy public process.
And I imagine the personalities of the leaders involved play a role too, right?
Absolutely.
You can have all the shared history and economic ties in the world, but if the leaders don't get along, that's going to make things tough.
Personal relationships, trust, even shared humor. These can grease the wheels of diplomacy or throw sand in the gears.
It's all about those personal connections.
The G7 is a human system, after all, not just a collection of economic indicators.
Okay, so we've got this internal family dynamic going on, but the G7 isn't operating in a vacuum.
Right.
They're constantly interacting with other countries and international organizations. How does that play out?
Well, the G7 engages with a whole spectrum of global actors, from emerging economies like China and India to international institutions like the United Nations and the World Bank.
A lot of moving parts.
These relationships are complex and often shaped by competing interests.
The G7 has a history of working with these international organizations on issues like poverty reduction and global health.
They've collaborated on some major initiatives.
But there's also that criticism that they try to dominate those institutions, push their own agendas.
Yeah, that perception definitely exists.
How do we square those two things?
Well, it's a valid concern. The G7 does hold considerable power within these organizations, stemming from their combined economic weight and historical influence.
It's hard to ignore a group that controls that much of the global economy.
But it's not always a one-way street. Those institutions also provide a platform for other countries to voice their concerns and push back against G7 dominance.
So it's a constant negotiation, a back and forth between asserting influence and finding common ground.
It's a delicate dance.
It makes me think of those scenes in movies where diplomats are huddled whispering in hallways trying to hammer out an agreement before a big summit.
That's a surprisingly accurate image. Diplomacy often happens behind the scenes in those informal conversations where relationships are built, compromises are made, and the stage is set for those grand pronouncements we see in the headlines.
So much happening behind closed doors.
That's where the real work gets done.
Okay, so we've got these internal dynamics within the G7, this complex web of relationships with other global players. It all leads back to that question that keeps popping up.
Yeah.
Is the G7 still relevant in a world where power is shifting and the challenges are increasingly global?
That's the million-dollar question. And to answer it, we need to dig into the arguments for and against the G7's continued relevance.
Okay, let's do it.
Because there are valid points on both sides.
Let's start with the optimists. Why do some people believe the G7 still matters? What are its strengths?
Those who defend the G7 often point to its history of cooperation and its capacity for swift action.
They see it as a group that can get things done.
They argue that the G7 has repeatedly shown its ability to address global crises, from financial meltdowns to pandemics.
Right, stepping up when needed.
And that its shared values create a foundation for effective collaboration.
So they see it as a force for stability in a world that often feels chaotic and unpredictable.
Exactly, the source of order in the midst of uncertainty.
And I can see the appeal of that, especially when we're facing global issues that need coordinated action, like climate change.
That's a prime example.
Supporters argue that the G7's economic clout and political influence make it a vital player in tackling those global challenges. They see it as a forum where leaders can come together, forge agreements, and set the agenda for international action.
It's a platform for global leadership.
But of course, there's the other side of the coin. What are the criticisms leveled against the G7, and why do some people think it's time for it to fade away?
Well, the most common criticism is that the G7 is simply too exclusive. Its membership fixed for decades doesn't reflect the current realities of global power.
So it's stuck in the past.
Countries like China, India, Brazil, major players on the economic and political stage, are excluded from the inner circle.
And that exclusion feeds into the argument that the G7 is out of touch, that its solutions are tailored to the interests of a select few rather than serving the needs of the wider world.
Right. It raises questions about whose voices are being heard and whose interests are being prioritized.
It makes you wonder whose voices are missing and how would those missing voices change the conversation.
That's a crucial point. Critics argue that the G7's limited membership undermines its legitimacy and effectiveness. They point to issues like climate change and global inequality, where solutions require buy-in from a much broader range of countries than just the G7.
So it's not just about who's at the table, it's about the impact of their decisions on those who aren't.
Exactly.
So we've got these two contrasting views, the G7 as a vital forum for global cooperation versus the G7 as an outdated, exclusive club. It's almost like a philosophical debate about the nature of global governance itself.
It really gets to the heart of how we manage global affairs in the 21st century.
And at the heart of that debate is the question of adaptation.
Can the G7 evolve to address these criticisms, to become more inclusive and representative of a multipolar world?
Or is it fundamentally limited by its structure and history?
That's the challenge they're facing.
All right, welcome back. We've spent the last two parts really digging into the G7, the history, the power dynamics, the criticisms. It's a lot to take in.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground.
But now I think it's time to zoom in a bit and explore what all of this actually means for people around the world.
Right, because it's easy to get lost in the abstract talk of economic indicators and geopolitical maneuvering.
Yeah.
But the decisions made at those G7 summits, they ripple outwards and affect the lives of farmers, factory workers' families trying to make ends meet.
It's a human story at its core.
It is.
Exactly. And that's what we want to uncover in this final part. How do those grand pronouncements, those agreements on trade or development, translate into real-world impacts? What are the stories that don't always make it into the headlines?
Well, let's start with trade, because it's one of the most obvious ways the G7's actions affect people's lives.
Okay.
These countries are economic giants.
Right.
And the trade deals they negotiate can reshape entire industries, create jobs in one place, and lead to job losses in another.
Right. It's that whole globalization debate, the winners and losers. And I remember from one of the articles you sent me that a G7-backed trade deal actually led to a surge in textile manufacturing in Bangladesh.
Oh, right. Yeah.
But at the same time, it put a lot of garment workers in the U.S. out of jobs.
It's a classic example.
The complex picture.
It highlights that tension between promoting economic growth on a global scale and protecting local jobs and industries.
Right.
And often the most vulnerable populations, those without the resources to adapt to these rapid shifts, end up bearing the brunt of the negative impacts.
So it's not just about whether a trade deal boosts overall GDP. It's about who benefits, who gets left behind, and whether those costs and benefits are distributed fairly.
It's a question of equity.
It adds a whole layer of ethical considerations to the equation.
It's not just about numbers, it's about people's lives.
All right, so trade is a big one. Another area where the G7 wields a lot of influence is in development assistance.
Right, billions of dollars in aid flowing from these countries to developing nations.
It's got to be making a difference, right?
Development aid is a powerful tool. It can fund essential services like healthcare and education, help build critical infrastructure, and provide a lifeline for communities struggling with poverty or disaster.
It sounds essential.
But it's not as simple as just writing a check.
Yeah, I've heard criticisms that some aid programs end up creating dependency, that they don't address the root causes of poverty, or that the money doesn't always reach the people who need it most.
Those are all valid concerns, and it's something the G7 has grappled with for decades.
So has there been any progress?
There's been a shift in recent years towards more sustainable models of development, focusing on local partnerships, empowering communities, and ensuring that aid is used effectively.
So it's about moving away from that top-down approach, that we know best mentality, and recognizing that lasting solutions come from within, from those who are closest to the challenges.
It's about collaboration, not just charity.
And it requires the G7 to really listen to the needs of developing countries, to trust their expertise, and to support their own visions for development, rather than imposing prepackaged solutions.
It's about respecting their agency.
Okay, so we've talked about trade development, but there's one more piece of the G7 puzzle we need to address: global security.
All right, their decisions on conflict, terrorism, cybersecurity, these have enormous consequences for people around the world.
Absolutely, and this is where the stakes get incredibly high. Think about the G7's role in peacekeeping operations, their efforts to combat terrorism, their negotiations on arms control.
These aren't just theoretical discussions happening in boardrooms.
Right.
They're playing out in real time, affecting the lives of people caught in conflict zones or threatened by violence.
It's a heavy responsibility, and it raises a lot of questions about the ethics of intervention, about the use of military force, about the balance between protecting national interests and upholding human rights.
There are no easy answers.
It's a minefield, to say the least.
But what's crucial is that the G7 recognizes the human cost of its decisions, that it prioritizes diplomacy and conflict prevention, and that it works to build a more peaceful and just world.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the G7, it seems like the key takeaway is that this isn't just a story about powerful countries and global summits.
It's about people.
About the ripple effects of decisions made at the highest levels and how those ripples reach every corner of the globe.
Exactly. And it's a story that we're all a part of, whether we realize it or not.
We're all connected.
The G7's actions, their successes and failures, have a profound impact on our lives. And it's crucial that we engage with these issues, that we hold our leaders accountable, and that we work to build a world where everyone has the opportunity to thrive.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? We've given you a lot to consider. Now it's up to you to keep exploring, keep asking questions, and most importantly, keep engaging with the world around you. Because the future of the G7, the future of global governance, it's not predetermined. It's being shaped right now by the choices we make individually and collectively.
And that's a powerful thought. To end on the G7 may be an exclusive club, but the challenges they address, the solutions they pursue, these are things that affect us all. So stay informed, stay engaged, and keep pushing for a better tomorrow.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.